Good to see you again, Randy.
Yeah, you too, Marcus. It's been a while, and I'm glad we finally had a chance to connect. We have a lot to talk about. So there's a couple of topics I had written down and we had talked about last week, and I thought I'd start off with something I found very interesting here, and that is a book online by Trevor Weaver and Marcus Allen. I just happened to be looking, and I found The Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence, a Reference Guide to the Facts by Marcus Allen and Trevor Weaver. Marcus, you're an author, yes.
There's the book.
I'm glad that you've done this. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's basically a book which takes all the objections put forward by the skeptics, people who challenge what we say when we claim that Apollo never happened, which it didn't. But they're the people who parrot NASA's responses. So what Trevor and I have done is to put together a collection of all the points that these people make. They say that we're wrong about what we say. And it's got 29 different chapters, such as keeping the secret. How do you keep 400,000 people from keeping a secret? Another one on not easier to fake it. People who say, well, it's easier to go to the moon than to fake it. Well, they don't know what they're talking about. The Saturn V rocket, which is something that you've been looking at in detail. The lost Apollo 13 capsule. And here's the question. Here's your starter for 10. Anybody who can answer this question goes to the top of the class. How many of the Apollo command modules are on display for each mission? There were 6 missions. How many command modules are on display? And is there a command mission, an Apollo mission, of which there's more than one command module on display? We'll come to the details of that a bit later, maybe.
Yes, very interesting details for sure.
Yeah, then avoiding the radiation, which is a perennial subject.
Yeah.
The skeptics of our position say that, it's just like a couple of chest x-rays. No worry about it at all. That's not true. The transmission delays. Anyway, there's 29 chapters in this book looking at all the evidence that is put forward against the position we take, which is that Apollo never happened.
Sounds like a very good read.
It's basically a reference guide to the facts, which is what we call it. So, yeah, it's certainly worth checking out because it gives you some of the clues. What I find interesting today is that there are more and more people that I talk to. All right, many of them know my position on Apollo, but none of them disagree with what I say. They claim, no, I don't see any evidence for Apollo happening the way that NASA says. That's basically what they claim. Most young people I speak to say, of course it never happened. I mean, you can tell that if you look at the details. And young people are fairly well clued up in looking at images, looking at the NASA films. And of course, some of those NASA films are missing, aren't they? They're not available to look at, like the original transmission of the Apollo 11 moonwalk, the EVA, extravehicular activity.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I noticed when I was researching my first book. I came across online historians, space historians, and they admitted, even though they're staunch proponents of the Apollo missions, that there was gaps within the records, gap after gap after gap. And even with the microfilm, which has been cited as a response to my talking about this, and I've had, NASA proponents say, well, there's microfilm, it's all in microfilm. No, it's not, because I've quoted historians in my first book talking about microfilm, gaps within the microfilm. That had to be done by design.
Yeah.
On microfilm. Well, all was done by design, but that really speaks to some nefarious activity going on there. Everywhere you look, there's gaps.
And one of the most recognizable gaps that I've come across is how many people can point to a photograph of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. Not in the film, there's films of him because that was just a camera pointing out the window. Photographs of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. There's a reflection of him in allegedly Buzz Aldrin's visor. I say allegedly because we don't know it's Buzz Aldrin. Just because it says so on his chest doesn't mean it's him inside.
And we don't know if it's in Armstrong either.
And the other one is that it was a panoramic series of pictures taken by Buzz Aldrin which showed the back view of presumably Neil Armstrong attending to something on the lunar lander. That's the sum total of the photographs of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. It's as if he didn't want to be photographed there. It's as if he didn't want to be connected with the fraud that was going on.
Has he ever responded to a question about that?
Well, the only response that I've seen, which is quite telling, is when Bart Sibrel approached Neil Armstrong and asked him to swear on a Bible that he had walked on the lunar surface. So what does Neil Armstrong do? He doesn't put his hand on the Bible and say, "Of course I walked on the lunar surface, you idiot. Haven't you seen the pictures and the films?" No. What Neil Armstrong does is turns on his heels and walks away.
Yeah.
He will not engage with Bart Sibrel, who was trying to get the moonwalkers, the series of Apollo astronauts who allegedly walked on the lunar surface, to swear on a Bible that they had done that.
That's a very telling sign, a very telling situation, and it's also a very telling response to being reminded that you're living a lie. And some of the responses, we all know the famous one with Buzz Aldrin, but some of the responses he got were just incredible. I mean, I felt almost embarrassed for the astronauts in the way they were responding. I think there was one or two that was civilized about it, but most of them were not. They were downright abusive, and it was as if we're not hiding anything. We have nothing to hide. We're not lying. We're not lying. And it was their response that really confirmed the lie. I thought it was a brilliant strategy on Bart Sibrel's part because he actually solicited the truth from them in their behavior.
Yes, he did, which is a very good way because they demonstrated by their behavior, as you say, the reaction to the question. It was a very legitimate question to ask somebody.
Exactly.
So Bart Sibrel managed to get punched by Buzz Aldrin when he called him a cheat, a thief and a liar, because he cheated by saying that he'd been to the moon when he hadn't, a thief because he took money for interviews to claim he'd done something he hadn't, and a liar to claim that he'd been to the moon. So he got punched for that. He got kicked by Ed Mitchell, his son, who was overheard on the microphone that Bart Sibrel had used to record the interview, and he'd just forgotten to remove it. So his son was heard saying, "Should we call the CIA and get him whacked?" i.e. killed. This is a death threat.
I saw that clip. I was absolutely stunned that they would take a chance in saying something like that. I was shocked when I heard that because that was a blatant admission of their connection. Obviously, the CIA was on the forefront of their minds when he said that, on both of them. And it was, I think you're right, it was the son that said it. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And, you know, we often put these individuals on a pedestal, you know, oh, they're really smart, these intelligence agencies and people that work for them are very intelligent, highly intelligent. No, not always. In fact, they can be quite the opposite. And that was an example of that right there. Should we call the CIA and have them taken out? I mean, that was just the height of stupidity. I've never quite seen that before. That showed a lot of frustration. See, there again, there's the response that Bart Sibrel solicited, revealing the lie in their behavior.
It was actually a very good strategy, which actually delivered more than Bart had expected.
Yes.
Because he was able to record this.
Yeah.
He'd put the camera back into his car before he left.
Yeah.
Without realizing that, well, I don't know if he realized or not, but the microphone was still operating.
Yeah.
The story is not complete because we still have people who claim that man has landed on the lunar surface.
Yeah.
The investigation that you've done demonstrated that the Saturn V rocket couldn't do what it was claimed to have done. The engines were not powerful enough. Or maybe the engines were powerful enough, but they didn't work for long enough.
Yeah, and I'm looking now into that again for eventually a third book. I'm going to revisit that subject. There's some additional information that I want to add to that, but I keep going back and looking at the lack of testing that was done, and no one has had a reasonable explanation for that, including any engineer. I've never heard of an engineer ever in any industry cutting corners in any industry, let alone something of this magnitude. And that's exactly what they did from Apollo 6 to the first manned mission of Apollo 8. We can get into that later because there's a lot of details there, but for those that want to look up what I mean, just look up Apollo 6, the second unmanned mission, and go forward to Apollo 8, which is the first manned mission of the Saturn V, and you'll see what I'm talking about. No engineers offered up an explanation for that. They just say that we're geniuses and we know what we were doing.
From a pilot's point of view, which you are, you're a pilot, if you were asked to fly an aircraft that had that little testing of its engine, would you get into that aircraft?
Even if the aircraft was a brand new Cessna 172, very reliable aircraft, four-seater, it's used for flight training as well as for sightseeing flights. It's a very good aircraft. It's multi-purpose in that respect. Cessna has done a very good job at building and manufacturing, designing and manufacturing these aircraft for decades. So having said that, they have quite a reliable record in terms of small aircraft, very reliable aircraft in terms of its efficiency, its safety, so on and so forth. However, having said that, if an aircraft was produced tomorrow, a Cessna 172, right off the line, and Randy, here's this brand new aircraft, we didn't do any testing on it, we didn't test the engines, we didn't do any a 50-hour test because we know that it works because we have previous history, decades of the Cessna 172 performing perfectly. Would I fly it? One word, no. That aircraft has to go through testing with a proper test pilot before me, as an average pilot, will get in and fly it. That plane has to be tested. Technology being what it is, sure, you've got a track record, but every new piece of technology, goes for cars as well, are tested to some degree. So absolutely no, I wouldn't fly it unless it had its proper testing done. Practical testing, not the actual static testing. I'm talking about testing in the air for the aircraft.
Under flight conditions.
Under flight conditions. And they take those aircraft through multiple environments. In fact, those aircraft are stressed beyond the limits according to the flight manual for safety reasons.
Yeah, just to find out if it's going to break.
Yeah, exactly. On all aircraft, whether it's a small aircraft or a large aircraft like the A380, for example, they all have something in common. They all go through both testings, right? Static testing as well as flight testing. So that begs the question for an astronaut, why would you risk your lives and the lives of your crew on a brand new technology, which was the Saturn V, that had absolutely no testing after the mission of the second unmanned flight of the Saturn V with Apollo 6, and then 7 months later, they put a manned crew on board without any testing. I don't even think there was any static testing. There might have been a start of the engines, but there was no real static testing. There was definitely no further unmanned missions of the Saturn V to see if it was working. Marcus, one of the criticisms that I've received from people is, the space industry is different from the airline industry because that airline industry is commercial and they have to do all that testing for the safety of passengers and for certification. That's true. But I've never really said that rockets should be tested the amount of times that aircraft are tested. It just would be impossible because of the cost involved. But we're not talking 1,000 hours of testing for the Saturn V. We're talking at least maybe 5-10 launches of the Saturn V unmanned to make sure that you get some consistencies in the data, even though those engines are not reusable. At least what you're looking for is consistency in the data for each performance of the launch. Yeah. Now, it's interesting to note that they basically did that with the Saturn 1B.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
But they didn't do that with the Saturn V, so the conclusion is that they didn't match their own standards with the Saturn V.
Yeah. I mean, from a point of view of aerospace travel, rockets are one use only, and then they're tipped into the ocean.
Yeah.
Planes are obviously different. They're commercial. Passengers get on them, private individuals get on them. They have to be safe. And we've seen the trouble with the Boeing 737 MAX and the problems that has had. Talk about shortcuts and the damage that shortcuts can do to you as a company. And Boeing have suffered billions of dollars as a result of that. Anyway, It's not the same thing, testing aircraft, as testing rockets.
Yes.
But rockets still have to be tested to prove that they can work. What's the total flight time for the F1 engine before they put humans on board?
Yeah, so the total flight time, now this isn't the static time, and people get on me about this. Now, I always differentiate between the static. They had, overall, multiple F1 engines had about 70 hours of static testing. So, yeah. I mean, that sounds very reasonable, all right? I don't have a problem with that. I don't think anybody with engineers have a problem with that either. But when you look at the combined total of flights for Apollo 4, Apollo 6, and you look at the duration of the F1 engines in terms of their use from launch to an altitude of approximately 40 miles, this is about 2 minutes. So combine the first two missions and factor in Apollo 6, which was a near disaster.
Yeah.
They had a combined total of 4 minutes of actual testing in flight conditions before they put the first manned crew on board 7 months later with Apollo 8.
Yeah, exactly.
That's definitely a recipe for disaster.
But then, if you're going to test a rocket, it's going to go from ground level, ground pressure, 14.7 pound per square inch, into the upper atmospheres. You say 40 miles up, that's the height at which the rocket disappears from view.
Yeah.
And 40 miles is 220,000 feet. That's nearly space. Space is the Kármán line, which is 100 kilometers up, 60 miles. So it was not quite in space by that definition, but it was still in a very, very different atmospheric condition. Air pressure and the speed of the rocket through that air would have had an effect on the structure of the rocket. You had to have tested it under those conditions. It's all very well doing static testing. Yeah, you could fire the rocket, but it's still at ground level. It's still at 14.7 pound per square inch. How do you know how it's going to be affected when it's in a near vacuum near the Kármán line? You don't know until you put something there. Even though they had the vacuum chamber at the Sandusky chamber, the Glenn Research Center in Ohio, even though they had that, they didn't put the engines in it. They couldn't test them firing in it because there's nowhere for the fumes to go. But you'd think they'd have at least used a vacuum chamber to see what effect it had on the structure of the engine prior to firing it. No, they didn't do any of that. So there was so little testing done. And as you say, when Apollo 6 was launched, it was nearly a disaster because they found out then they had this pogo effect where it's jumping up and down. That was to do with the amount of fuel that was going in and the amount of burning that was taking place. And there was a major problem, which we're told was resolved. I hope it was, because Apollo 6 was followed by Apollo 7, which was a Earth orbit.
Yeah.
Basically, it was a Saturn 1 rocket. And then they go to Apollo 8, which is the first launch with humans on board of the Saturn V rocket, and it's going to the moon.
Yeah.
We're told.
Yeah. And that was 7 months after the launch of Apollo 6. I want to add one thing to what you said there, and it's because what you said is absolutely true. And I think I documented this in my first book. NASA did wind tunnel testing on their rockets, and they scale models, that is, of the Saturn V. But they admit that they weren't able to duplicate higher altitude dynamic forces on the Saturn V. So they really never had a chance to see how the effect, as you say, of dynamic forces on the whole structure combined with the output of the F1 engines. That all has to be factored in and all has to be tested, and it has to go through rigorous testing. Now, again, I'm not talking that they should have launched it 1,000 times. That's just financially impossible. But they didn't even match their own standards with the Saturn 1B. They could have done at least 4, maybe 4 or 5 on-land launches of the Saturn V after Apollo 6. In other words, 3 or 4 or 5 more, which is still low, but at least they would have had something to work with. They would have been able to say, well, look, we have this consistency with each launch. Yes, every launch is destroyed, the equipment is destroyed after the launch, but we have some consistency in the data. They didn't even do that with the Saturn V.
And the reason they didn't do it, in my opinion, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, is they knew they were not going to go there. They knew it was going to be faked.
Yeah.
Because they knew how difficult it was. They discovered a lot of the problems. Certainly with the command module on Apollo 1, the Apollo 1 fire in January 1967, and they had to redesign the whole command module. The whole concept of Apollo was changed.
Yeah.
And at that point, somebody might have said, hey, are we really going to be able to achieve President Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade, i.e. 1969, and return him safely to Earth? Getting him to the moon really wasn't a problem, because that had been done with unmanned craft. The Russians had done it several times. Americans had sent unmanned craft, the Surveyor craft, the Ranger craft, the Lunar Orbiter craft. They had been sent to the moon, so they could get to the moon, but not one of those ever came back to Earth. The first time it ever happened was with the Soviet Union on Zond 5. September 1968, they orbited the moon and returned to Earth, landed in the Indian Ocean. There are pictures of it. The first time it had ever happened that a craft had returned from lunar orbit. But they didn't know they could do it. And yet, 3 months after that, America are launching Apollo 8 with humans on board to orbit the moon and return to Earth. Yeah, they may have returned to Earth, but they don't see the evidence that they orbited the moon.
Yep.
Well, NASA says they did it, therefore they did. No, that's not evidence. That's hearsay.
Well, I definitely cannot disagree with you on anything you've said right now. You're absolutely right, and I haven't seen anyone else come back and try to counter anything you have said. I've been on this for the last 2 to 3 years, writing my books and watching the videos and reading the comments, and I've never seen anybody come back with any counter response.
I get emails from people all over the world saying, oh, I saw one of your videos recently, and, you know, I agree with what you say, or I disagree with what you say. I think you're a liar, one of them says. I think, well, okay, tell me how I did it. What was I lying about?
Exactly.
Do I ever get a reply? No, I don't. Because they're sort of one-hit mission. They think they're going to upset you by coming along and saying, oh, you're a liar, or you're this, or you're that, or you don't know what you're talking about. They're the NASA supporters, or as I now call them, the NASA parrots, because they just parrot what NASA tell them to say.
But it's interesting that you were saying emails from around the world. I get them occasionally too, but I never get, and I don't think you do either, we never get any challenging emails in terms of Marcus or Randy, you said this, what about this? It's you said this, and you're an idiot.
Yeah,
that's the response we get.
Yeah.
They never back it up with anything of their own. Fine, you know what? As you say yourself, Marcus, if I'm wrong, prove me wrong.
Yeah, prove me wrong.
Yeah. And that leads me into your work with Robert Williams and Scott Henderson in terms of the work that the three of you have done. I'd really like you to talk about that, your work in regarding the film In a Vacuum of Space, because that is, for me, that just solidifies the whole Apollo record, the photo and film record being faked. So I'd like you to talk about that.
If we're going to talk about film in space, which we are, we need to know what it looks like. Photographic film is what we're talking about. Because Apollo used photographic film cameras. Hasselblad cameras, brilliant cameras, very good cameras, no problem with that. But they used photographic film inside the camera because, guess what, digital cameras hadn't been invented by then. But what I'm talking about here are the still photographs taken on the lunar surface by the named astronauts using the Hasselblad cameras. And we all know what the Hasselblad camera looks like. I've handled a replica of the Apollo cameras. They're very good cameras. You have to know one thing about those cameras. They have no viewfinder. And they're mounted on the astronauts' chests. We've seen pictures of it, so it's not in dispute. So they have to move their body to point the camera. All right, you can take the camera off and you can use it, but you still haven't got a viewfinder. So how do you work out what you're going to photograph? And there's a couple of photographs taken on Apollo 11 of the Earth, picture of the Earth. Think about it for a minute. If you're standing on Earth and looking at the moon, what you see is the full face of the moon, if it's a full moon, you see the full face of the moon. So if you're standing on the moon, where would you look if you're on basically the equator of the moon? Where would you look to see Earth? You would look more or less overhead.
Yeah.
Now that's quite high. If you've got a camera on your chest, how do you know you've got the Earth in the camera? You don't, because you've got a viewfinder. So what you do, any photographer will tell you this, if you haven't got a viewfinder, you take lots and lots and lots and lots of pictures, adjusting it very slightly, and you hope that one of them is going to be what you want, in this case showing Earth. They took 2 pictures, that's all, 2 pictures. But in order to take those pictures of Earth, they had to be leaning so far back, because Earth would be at least 60 degrees above them, leaning so far back they'd probably tip over. It's a fake photograph. And if anybody can show it isn't a fake photograph, come on, let's hear about it. You NASA supporters, you groupies, you parrots, come on, let's hear about it. I'm saying that photograph is faked. Prove me wrong. Anyway, so they got these photographs, and there are some on Apollo 17 which do the same thing, but they got even cleverer then. They had Apollo 17 photographs of the Earth and the flag and the other astronaut in the same picture. Wow! How did they do that? And even more impressive, the flag is pointing at the Earth. How did they know they were pointing at the Earth? It's just so laughable that they think we're going to accept this as reality, when all you've got to do is a bit of logical thinking, critical analysis, and you can show that the whole thing is a complete fabrication, which the whole moon landing thing was. It was a fabrication for political purposes. But also because Kennedy, who had issued the initial challenge to land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth, had been killed. Yeah. So he was martyred. His promise had to be maintained. In order to do it, they cut corners, they made mistakes, and now 50 years later they can't even go back to the moon. They haven't got a rocket that's been tested yet, let alone launched. With the SLS, the slow, late and expensive rocket that they keep guttering on about how powerful it is. No matter how powerful it is, get it off the ground, guys. Show it can work. Haven't done that yet. And you mentioned Jack Parsons. Of course, the SLS rocket uses solid fuel boosters, the 2 white tubes on the side, solid fuel boosters. That was based on the work of Jack Parsons, who developed solid fuel. He worked out how to create the solid fuel and then ignite it so it would burn sensibly and it wouldn't explode. Now here's the question. Can photographic film work in a vacuum? And I'm talking about the vacuum of space. Does it work? The answer is no, it doesn't. So how do we know this? How do we know that film does not work in the vacuum of space? Until 2018, I didn't know anything about the vacuum of space affecting photographic film until I attended a lecture given at the British Interplanetary Society, of which I'm a member, by a gentleman with the name of Phil Pressel, who was the designer and developer of the camera equipment used on the Hexagon reconnaissance satellite, or spy satellite, more likely. He was very proud of what he'd done. It was a stereo camera. There were 2 cameras working in conjunction, because what it was intended to do was to overfly Russia on a polar orbit, photographing whatever sights it came across. And by having a stereo camera, photo analysis of the pictures after they'd been returned to Earth, they would be able to calculate the size of the rocket, the length of a battleship in port, and various other calculations required for national security in America to determine if the Soviets were ahead of America in terms of space. This is 1970, the first Hexagon spy satellite was launched. And during the talk, Phil Pressel was a charming man, lovely man. He'd retired. Obviously, he'd been working at Elmer Perkins. That was the company that produced the camera equipment. And he was describing it and pointing out features on the camera and how the film was carried across from the 30 miles of film that was on the spools on which the camera was using the film, 6-inch wide film, and he said, almost in passing, as if everybody knew about it, well, of course, we had to keep the film pressurized because film doesn't work in a vacuum. I thought, what? I've never heard this. Nobody's ever mentioned this before. And the reason it's never been mentioned before is because the hexagon spy satellite and its workings were classified. Obviously, it was a spy satellite. America were not going to tell everybody how they worked. It was classified until 2011, when it was declassified. But he made that one comment. Of course, we had to keep the film under a small amount of pressure, and he showed all the tubes in which the film was carried from the spools through the camera to the buckets that dropped the film. And I thought, sort of bulb went off in my head at that point. I thought, hang on a minute, film cannot work in a vacuum. This stuff can't work in a vacuum. And this is from a person who would obviously know about it, because he'd worked on the camera equipment. He showed us all the tubes that film had to go through. So when the talk was over and question time, I asked him, I said, would the same restrictions apply to Apollo? Of course they would, he said. Film doesn't work in a vacuum. End of story.